I thought I had cried all the tears a woman can cry. Then Victor said my husband left him everything. The clink of a spoon on a saucer somewhere in the back sounded like a hammer. My hands stopped shaking. I knew exactly what I had to do. My name is Ruth Ellison, and I buried my husband Thomas on a grey Thursday that smelled like rain. We were married 43 years. We built our little world brick by brick, sometimes with money, sometimes with sweat, always with our names side by side. The church hall was full of faces that had watched us grow older together. I wore the same simple black dress I wore to our daughter's graduation. Thomas always said I looked most like myself in it. I kept his wedding band in my palm that day, warm from my skin, like a small sun I didn't want to set. Thomas was a planner. He kept lists, paper lists, with tidy boxes to tick, and he never liked surprises unless they came with birthday candles. When the doctor pulled us into that small room with the soft chairs and used the kind of words people don't say out loud at the dinner table, Thomas took my hand and squeezed once, hard. On the drive home, he said, "We're going to put things in order, Ruth. Everything in order." He meant the accounts, the partnership paperwork, the will. He also meant the messes people make when they think no one is watching. Which brings me to Victor Hale. He wasn't family, though he liked to act like it when there were cameras or donors. He came on board 20 years ago when Thomas decided to expand from 2 trucks to a fleet. Victor was quick with numbers and quicker with compliments. He called me Mrs. E as if we were old friends, but never truly knew us. Thomas saw the good in everyone. I learned to listen between people's sentences. 2 weeks before Thomas died, he took me into his study. It still smelled like cedar from the pencil box our grandson made him in 5th grade. He closed the door and sat me down. "Ruth," he said, "you're going to hear a lot of noise when I'm gone. I want you to trust what's in your hands, not what's in your ears." He tapped a manila envelope on the desk. It had a thin blue ribbon around it and a notary stamp peeking from the flap. "If anything sounds wrong, you take this out and you read it, out loud if you have to." I told him I didn't want to talk about that yet. He smiled the tired smile he'd learned in the hospital. "Humor me," he said. "You've been humoring me a long time." We laughed, which kept us from crying. I put the envelope in my cedar chest under the quilts my mother stitched during winters when the power went out. I told no one. At the memorial, I sat between our son Daniel and our daughter Marie. They each held a corner of my shawl, like they were keeping me from drifting away. The slideshow ran on a loop. Thomas in a fishing hat, Thomas grilling hot dogs with a ridiculous apron, Thomas dancing with our granddaughter in his socks on the kitchen linoleum. People took turns at the podium, some with jokes that made us smile, some with stories that made us dab at our eyes. The pastor thanked everyone and opened the floor for any last words. Victor rose like a man accustomed to cameras finding him. He moved with that theatrical solemnity people copy from movies. "Thomas was a visionary," he began, and he wasn't wrong. He talked about the company's early days, about our long nights and our bold risks. And I let him have those sentences because grief makes people grab for importance. But then his voice changed, flattened into something metallic. "Before he passed," Victor said, "Thomas and I discussed the future at length. He wanted stability. He wanted momentum. He wanted our vision protected. And so, in his final arrangements, he ceded full control, assets, shares, everything, to me, to ensure continuity and protect the enterprise." The room went silent. Even the slideshow seemed to pause on a photo where Thomas was halfway between a smile and a laugh. I felt Daniel's hand clamp down on my arm. Marie whispered, "Mum?" like a question with only bad answers. A few people nodded because they didn't know any better. One woman from accounting covered her mouth as if she'd been slapped. I didn't stand right away. I've learned that standing too fast can make you lightheaded, and I intended to be very steady. I put Thomas's ring back into my purse. I smoothed my dress. I looked at the pastor and then at Victor. who was already accepting sympathetic pats on the back like a widower. I thought about Thomas in that small study with the cedar smell, about the envelope under my quilts, about his voice telling me to trust what's in my hands. I stood. The metal chair legs scraped, and that sound reached every corner of the hall. "Pastor," I said, keeping my voice even, "if I may." He gestured, relieved to shift attention back to the family. Victor tried to keep the microphone, fingers curled around it like a lifeline, but the pastor took it and placed it in my hand. It was heavier than it looked. I faced the room, the faces that had watched us age, and I let myself breathe once, deep and slow, the way the nurse taught me for dizziness. "You all knew my husband," I said. "You knew his jokes and his patience. You knew he kept promises." Heads nodded, eyes softened. "And you know me," I added, "because I was there beside him for 43 years. I'm not much for speeches, but I am very good at reading." I reached into my purse and felt the edge of an envelope that still smelled faintly of cedar. And for the first time since the doctor said the soft chair words, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready to say it out loud. I held that envelope in my hand, like it was the last rope on a sinking ship. The paper was thick, the way important paper should be. I didn't open it right away. Part of me wanted to see Victor's face as the silence stretched. He smirked, just a little, and that was all the fuel I needed. "This," I said clearly, holding it up for the room to see, "is my husband's will, the real will, signed, dated, notarized, and witnessed." There was a murmur across the rows. I caught sight of Mr. Calhoun, the attorney who handled our business paperwork, standing in the back. His white hair was unmistakable. He gave me the faintest nod, as if to say, "Go on, Ruth." Victor took a step toward me, his hands out like he was trying to calm a frightened animal. "Ruth," he said, his voice a smooth whisper meant only for me, but carrying far enough for others to hear. "This isn't the time. We can talk later." "This is the time," I interrupted. I was done letting him shape moments to suit himself. I looked around the hall, making sure I met the eyes of our employees, our friends, our children's friends, people who had trusted Thomas. Before Thomas passed, he told me something important. He said there might be a lot of noise when he was gone, and that I should trust what's in my hands, not what's in my ears. I tapped the envelope gently. A few heads tilted in understanding. Some of the older men leaned forward, as if sensing there was more to the story. Victor laughed once, a dry, forced sound. "You're making a scene, Ruth. Nobody here wants to—" I turned to the pastor. "With your permission, I'd like to read my husband's final words regarding his estate." The pastor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Go ahead, Mrs. Ellison." I opened the envelope slowly. The sound of the paper tearing was loud enough to make Victor flinch. Inside was the familiar cream-colored document, heavy with ink and official seals. I smoothed it over the podium. "In the event of my death," I began, my voice steady, "I, Thomas Ellison, leave all my personal and business assets to my wife, Ruth Ellison, and our children, Daniel and Marie Ellison, in equal distribution." There was a rustle in the crowd, papers shifting, feet moving, someone's quiet gasp. I continued. "It is my explicit instruction that my business partner, Victor Hale, be bought out of his shares within 6 months of my passing, at fair market value, using company funds allocated for that purpose." Now the murmurs grew louder. Some were whispers of disbelief. Others were short, sharp exclamations. I saw our head accountant, Lydia, exchange a look with one of the sales managers, a look that said, "We always suspected something." Victor's face drained of color. That's not what he told me," he stammered. "It's what he wrote down," I replied, tapping the signature line. And as we all know, words on paper witnessed and sealed are what the law honors. not whispered conversations without proof. Mr. Calhoun stepped forward from the back. "I can confirm," he said in his gravelly voice, "that this will is valid, updated, and in my possession until Mrs. Ellison requested it for today." He looked at Victor. "I oversaw the signing myself." Thomas was clear in his wishes. The room went utterly still. You could feel the shift, the crowd's silent alignment moving away from Victor and back toward me. Victor tried again. "Ruth, you're embarrassing yourself. This isn't—" "No, Victor," I said, my voice sharper now. "What's embarrassing is using my husband's memorial to spread a lie that would have stripped his wife and children of what he spent a lifetime building." Daniel stood then, his height making him look even more like his father. "Mum," he said, "do you want me to walk him out?" I shook my head. "No. Let him hear the rest." I finished reading the will. Clauses about charitable donations Thomas wanted to make, instructions for the company's continuation under trusted management, and a personal note about protecting the family's legacy. When I set the papers down, I felt the weight of the moment settle in the room. This wasn't just about a business. It was about trust, promises, and the truth standing taller than lies. Victor's jaw worked like he wanted to speak, but nothing came. He finally turned and walked out, the click of the door behind him echoing like a gavel. I looked out at the room. My husband lived with integrity. I will honor him by protecting what he left in my care. Thank you. The pastor said a closing prayer, but I hardly heard it. All I could think was that Thomas had been right. There was a lot of noise, but I had just cut through it, and I wasn't done yet. The days after the memorial were a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. People called, sent letters, even stopped me in the grocery store to say how brave I'd been. I didn't feel brave. I felt like a woman who had been handed a task by her husband and simply carried it out. But bravery wasn't the word I would use for what Thomas did in the weeks before he died. That was foresight. That was love. It had started one evening in early spring, just after the forsythia bloomed. Thomas had been quieter than usual during dinner, picking at his plate, sipping his iced tea without much enthusiasm. I asked him if the pain was worse. He shook his head and said, "It's not that." Then he looked at me the way he did when he was about to tell me something I wouldn't like. "Ruth," he began, "I've been going over the books. There are things I can't explain. Big withdrawals, investments I never approved, and the only other signature authorized for those accounts is Victor's." I felt my stomach sink. I'd known for years that Victor had an appetite for the finer things, trips to Europe under the guise of business conferences, the kind of suits that cost more than our first car. But Thomas always brushed it off. "That's just Victor," he'd say. "Flashy." But this wasn't flash. This was theft. "I've spoken to Calhoun," Thomas continued. "We're restructuring. I'm updating my will, locking Victor out of anything he can't legally touch. And if anything happens to me, I want you to have full control to deal with him as you see fit." I told him it was too much to take on, that he should be resting, not poring over legal language and bank statements. But he only smiled faintly. "I need to know you and the kids will be safe from him. It's the last thing I can do." A week later, I sat beside him in Calhoun's office as they went over the final draft. His hands trembled slightly as he signed, but his signature was still clear and confident. Calhoun affixed the notary seal, and Thomas placed the envelope in my lap. "Don't open it unless you need to," he said. "But if you need to, don't hesitate." That was Thomas, a man who planned for storms even when the skies were clear. The night before he passed, he was too weak to talk much. I sat with him, holding his hand, and he whispered, "Remember what I told you." I promised I would. When I saw Victor at the memorial, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit with a silk tie I'd never seen before, I had a bad feeling. The smirk he gave me before his speech told me he wasn't here just to grieve. And when he made his announcement, I understood exactly why Thomas had insisted on giving me that envelope. After the service, Daniel drove me home. He was quiet for most of the ride, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. "Mum," he said finally, "did Dad tell you Victor might try something like this?" I nodded. He told me exactly what to do if it happened. Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I'm glad you didn't let him get away with it. I don't think I could have kept my mouth shut." That night, I set the will on the kitchen table and made a fresh cup of tea. I went through it again, line by line, making sure I understood every word. I already knew the big picture. Everything to me and the children Victor bought out. But there were other details I hadn't focused on before. There was a clause about charitable giving, a scholarship in Thomas's name for students in our county. There were protections for the employees, severance packages, retirement contributions secured. Thomas had thought of everyone. It made me angry all over again to think that Victor had tried to twist this into something that benefited only him. The next morning, I called Calhoun. "We need to start the buyout process," I told him. He sighed. "I figured you'd say that. Be ready for a fight, Ruth. Victor's not the type to go quietly." I looked out the kitchen window at the bird feeder Thomas had fixed up last winter. The sparrows were still coming, even without him there to refill it. "That's fine," I said. "I'm not the type to be bullied." And I meant it. Calhoun moved fast. Within a week, the official buyout notice had been sent to Victor by certified mail. I pictured him opening that envelope, the same way I had at the memorial, only instead of cedar-scented reassurance, he'd get the cold language of legal obligation. 2 days later, he called me. His voice was sharp, stripped of the fake warmth he'd always used before. "Ruth," he said without greeting, "this is absurd. Thomas and I had an understanding." "You may have," I replied, "but Thomas and I had a marriage." And he put his understanding with me in writing, signed, sealed, notarized. That's the only understanding that matters now. He tried to talk over me, accusing me of ruining the company, of being vindictive. "Do you even know how to run a business of this size?" he scoffed. "I don't have to," I said calmly. "I only have to honor my husband's wishes. The rest will be handled by people who know what they're doing and who can be trusted." There was a pause, then a laugh that sounded more like a snarl. "We'll see what the board has to say about this." He hung up. He didn't waste time. At the next board meeting, he arrived early, dressed in his usual expensive suit, but with dark circles under his eyes. I came with Calhoun, the will, and a calm expression I had practiced in the mirror. The room was full board members, senior managers, even a couple of long-time employees who had been invited to speak on the company's future. Victor started before anyone could even sit. "We all know the business can't survive without strong leadership," he announced. "And with Thomas gone, I'm the logical choice. Ruth doesn't have the experience, and selling my shares back will drain the company's reserves." Calhoun cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, sliding a copy of the will across the table to each board member. "Thomas's instructions were explicit, and they are legally binding. The buyout will be conducted at fair market value, and funds have already been set aside in the company's financial plan for exactly this scenario." Murmurs broke out. One board member, a tall man with a gravelly voice, asked, "Victor, why didn't you mention this clause before?" Victor's face reddened. "Because it's a mistake. Thomas didn't mean it. He must have... Be careful with your words, Victor. You're talking about a man who was in full possession of his faculties when he signed that will. He knew exactly what he was doing, protecting his family and his company from you." Gasps went around the table. Lydia, the head accountant, spoke up. "I've reviewed the books. There are transactions here that Thomas never authorized funds moved into accounts tied to Victor's name. This wasn't oversight. It was deliberate." She slid a folder toward Calhoun. "And I have the documentation." Victor's jaw tightened. That's private business. It's company business, Lydia snapped. And as of now, it's under legal review. By the end of the meeting, the board had unanimously voted to proceed with the buyout. Victor stormed out without shaking anyone's hand, muttering about lawsuits. I stayed seated, letting the decision settle in the air. I knew it wasn't over. People like Victor didn't accept defeat easily. But he had lost his platform, and that was the first real step toward removing him entirely. As I walked out with Calhoun, he said quietly, "That was the turning point. From here on, it's just paperwork and patience." I looked at him and shook my head. "No, Calhoun. From here on, it's about making sure Victor never has another opportunity to do this to anyone else." And I meant every word. The weeks that followed felt like a chess match, except my opponent was playing with temper instead of strategy. Victor wasn't content to let the legal process grind on quietly. He started making noise. First came the phone calls. At first, they were civil, dripping with false politeness. "Ruth, we can still work this out without lawyers," he'd say. "If you just release the shares to me, I'll take care of everything. You'll be comfortable for life." "I already am," I'd answer, and hang up. When that didn't work, his tone shifted. "You're ruining Thomas's legacy," he hissed one afternoon. "People are talking. They think you're cold, heartless." I let him finish, then said, "Better to be called cold than to be caught stealing," and hung up again. Then came the rumors. I heard from Lydia that Victor was telling clients I was planning to dissolve the company, that employees' jobs were in jeopardy. At first, it infuriated me. Then it gave me an idea. The company was due to hold its annual charity banquet, the one Thomas loved most. It brought together clients, investors, employees, and local officials, all in one grand room. I decided I would be there, not in a corner, not in mourning, front and center. I called the event coordinator and arranged to take the opening speech slot, the one Thomas usually gave. I didn't tell Victor. The banquet hall glowed with warm light, crystal glasses lined up like soldiers. I wore a deep navy dress Thomas had always admired, and the pearl necklace he gave me on our 30th anniversary. When I walked in, the conversations dipped just slightly enough for me to know people had heard Victor's lies. Victor was there, of course, playing host like nothing had changed. He was mid-laugh with a group of board members when he saw me. The smile froze on his face, just for a moment. When the coordinator tapped the microphone and announced me as the evening's first speaker, his eyes narrowed. I stepped up to the podium and let the applause settle. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began. This event was Thomas's favorite, not because of the fancy dinner or the speeches, but because it reminded him of why he worked so hard. People. All of you. I paused, scanning the room, letting my gaze rest briefly on Victor before moving on. "Some of you have heard rumors about the company's future. I want to clear them up right now. The business will continue stronger than ever under leadership that honors Thomas's vision and operates with integrity." I let the word integrity hang in the air. Several people shifted uncomfortably. I continued, "The truth is, Thomas left specific instructions to ensure this company would remain in trustworthy hands. Those instructions are legally binding and are being carried out. That means certain changes are coming, changes that will protect the company from, let's call it mismanagement." Now I let my eyes meet Victor's, steady and unblinking. "Thomas built this with honesty and grit. That's the only way it will continue." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was long. More importantly, it was real. After the speech, people began approaching me directly. Investors wanting to confirm their support, employees quietly thanking me. The tide was turning, and Victor knew it. He confronted me near the coat check, his voice low and tense. "You think you're clever, don't you?" "I don't think, Victor," I said evenly. "I know, and so does everyone else in this room now." His jaw clenched. "This isn't over." I stepped closer. It will be, and it will end exactly the way Thomas planned. I walked away before he could respond, my heels clicking like punctuation marks. The next morning, Calhoun called. Word from my contact at the DA's office, they're looking into Victor's financial dealings. That speech of yours must have rattled the right cages. I smiled for the first time in days. Good. Let them dig. I've got nothing to hide. And for the first time since Thomas's passing, I began to feel like I was not just defending what he built, but actively securing it for the future. It started with a knock at my door early one Tuesday morning. I opened it to find Lydia standing there, clutching a heavy-looking binder. "I couldn't sleep," she said, walking straight into my kitchen. "I've been digging deeper into the records. You're going to want to see this." We sat at the table where Thomas and I had shared countless breakfasts. Lydia opened the binder to a spreadsheet thick with highlighted lines. "Here," she said, tapping the page. "Multiple payments disguised as vendor invoices. But the vendors don't exist. The bank accounts they lead to, all in Victor's name or connected to shell companies he controls." She looked up at me, her eyes sharp. "This isn't just bad bookkeeping, this is fraud." I called Calhoun immediately. He didn't waste time. By Thursday, the DA's office had copies of Lydia's binder, and by Monday, Victor had a subpoena with his name on it. The news spread faster than wildfire. By the time I arrived at the office the next day to meet with Calhoun, people in the lobby were whispering openly about Hale's mess and the investigation. When I stepped into the boardroom, the few who had been sitting on the fence about the buyout now avoided Victor entirely. He arrived late, looking rumpled, a first for him. No crisp suit today, just a wrinkled shirt and a tie that hung loose. His usual swagger was gone. The meeting was short. Calhoun laid out the facts. The will was binding, the buyout mandatory. The DA was investigating possible embezzlement. Victor's position at the company was no longer tenable. I stayed silent for most of it, letting Calhoun speak. But when Victor tried to argue that the accusations were baseless, I leaned forward. "Thomas warned me about you," I said. "He didn't have proof at the time, but he had instincts. Now the proof is here, in black and white. You can leave quietly, or you can let this go to court and watch the whole town hear exactly how you treated your so-called friend's legacy." He glared at me, his lips pressed tight. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "What do you want?" "I want you out," I replied. "Today. Sign the buyout papers, return anything you've taken, and stay away from the company. In return, I won't speak to the press about your behavior, beyond confirming you've stepped down. You can deal with the DA's office without the weight of a public scandal." He looked at Calhoun, who simply nodded once. "It's the best deal you're going to get," the lawyer said. Victor signed. His hand shook as he scrawled his name. The official statement went out the next morning. Victor Hale has stepped down as co-owner and will no longer be involved in company operations. The Ellison family remains committed to upholding the values Thomas Ellison built the business on. But behind the scenes, the DA's investigation continued. I didn't need to know every detail, it was enough for me to hear that charges were likely. That week, I went into Thomas's study and sat at his desk. For the first time since he passed, I felt the air in the room lighten. His cedar-scented pencil box was still there. I rested my hand on it and whispered, "It's done, love, just like you asked." The buyout funds cleared into the family's account by Friday. I had no plans to keep the company forever. I wasn't interested in running day-to-day operations. But I knew exactly who would take over. Daniel and Marie had both grown up watching their father work, and they knew the employees by name. I called them into the study that evening and slid the official documents across the desk. "It's yours now," I told them. "Dad wanted this to stay in the family. Run it with his honesty, and never let anyone like Victor near it again." "Victor? I heard he left town not long after. Rumor had it he sold his house quickly and quietly. Some said he was trying to liquidate whatever assets he could before the DA's office froze them. I didn't care enough to verify. I'd already won the only battle that mattered, protecting Thomas's legacy. The morning the last set of papers was signed, the air felt different. I opened the windows of the house, even though it was still early spring and the breeze was cool. It carried the scent of wet earth and something else. Freedom, maybe. The company was finally out from under Victor's shadow. Daniel and Marie had taken over smoothly, leaning on a trusted operations manager Thomas had mentored for years. I could see the change already. Employees smiling more, investors returning calls, and the warehouse running like clockwork again. I had no desire to hover over their shoulders. My part was done, but I did have one more promise to keep. 2 weeks later, I met with the county's Education Foundation in a sunlit conference room downtown. I slid a check across the table, a portion of the buyout money Thomas had secured for us. I'd like to establish the Thomas Ellison Scholarship, I told them, for students in our county who want to study business ethics or community development. The woman across from me smiled warmly. He must have been a remarkable man. He was, I said simply, and he believed in giving people a fair start. The scholarship became an annual award, announced each spring. The first year we had a dinner in the same hall where Victor had tried to rewrite my husband's legacy. This time, the atmosphere was different light, hopeful. The young woman who won stood at the podium, hands trembling as she spoke about her dream of starting a non-profit to help local farmers. When she finished, I handed her the scholarship certificate and whispered, "Make it count." She nodded, eyes shining. As for me, I returned to a quieter life. I spent mornings tending Thomas's garden, making coffee the way he liked it, even though it was just for me now. Sometimes I'd sit on the back porch with a book and let the sound of the wind in the trees fill the silence. Every now and then, someone would stop me in town, an old employee, a neighbor, to say how proud Thomas would be. I'd smile and thank them. But the truth was, I already knew. I'd felt it the moment Victor signed those papers. One evening, I went into Thomas's study. The late sun was coming through the curtains, laying gold across his desk. I opened the cedar box where I kept his wedding band. It was warm in my hand, just like the day of the memorial. I sat in his chair and whispered, "It's all settled, love. The company is safe. Your name is safe. And the people who counted on you still can." For a moment, I almost imagined he'd walk in and tease me for getting sentimental, but instead, there was only the quiet and the soft rustle of the trees outside. I slid the ring back into the box, closed the lid, and stood. There was no more weight on my shoulders, no more unfinished business. I had kept my promise. And I knew, wherever Thomas was, he heard me.